There's a strange sickness, moving silently through society, a delusion, dressed in confidence, a boldness rooted not in knowledge, but in its absence, and it manifests in boardrooms, classrooms, newsrooms, anywhere. A voice is louder than its wisdom. You've seen it, felt it, perhaps even fallen victim to it. The bold declarations, the overconfident assertions, the smug grins of those who don't know enough to realize they know nothing at all. This is not arrogance. It is ignorance, masquerading as insight. And in the late 1990s, psychologists David Dunning and Justin Kruger gave this human flaw a name: the Dunning-Kruger effect, a cognitive bias in which the least competent people in a domain overestimate their own ability simply because they lack the very expertise needed to know how far they've missed the mark. This is more than just an academic phenomenon. It is a quiet catastrophe. It means that the loudest voices are often the least informed, that confidence is not always competence, and that those who truly understand a subject, the quiet ones, the cautious ones, they are often dismissed or drowned out by the very people they should be correcting. But why? Why does this happen? Why do the ignorant rise to prominence while the wise remain in the shadows? And more importantly, how do we protect ourselves from becoming just another deluded participant in the theater of false confidence? He entered the meeting like a storm, confident, certain, unshakable. Charts were irrelevant, data a distraction. He spoke in absolutes, rejected nuance, and mocked hesitation. The room bent to his will, not because he was right, but because he never paused long enough to doubt himself. Around the table sat men and women who had studied, researched, run simulations, prepared for weeks. But they hesitated. They qualified their statements. They said perhaps, and let's consider. Their caution, ironically, made them invisible. This is the first cruelty of the Dunning-Kruger effect. Ignorance shouts, wisdom whispers, and in a world that mistakes volume for value, the noise wins. Again and again. What no one knew was that the man had read one article the night before. One. And yet, he now lectured PhDs as though he had written the textbooks they studied. The worst part, he believed himself. The Dunning-Kruger effect is not about deceit. It's about delusion. He wasn't lying. He was simply unaware of how much he didn't know. And that is the most dangerous kind of confidence. After the meeting, the quietest voice, a woman in their 50s, with decades of fieldwork behind her, stared out the window. She could have dismantled his entire argument in 5 minutes. But she didn't. She had learned long ago, people don't want the truth. She wants her ego confirmed. In a just world, knowledge would command the room. In ours, charisma often does. And it leaves a trail of poor decisions, broken teams, and wasted potential behind it. The loudest voice is not always the strongest, and certainty is not always a sign of competence. Sometimes, it's a mask worn by the ignorant to keep themselves from looking in the mirror. It was her first month on the job, barely 22, fresh out of college, and already brimming with opinions. She questioned everything: models, structure, strategies, not with curiosity, but with contempt, as if the decades of experience in the room were simply outdated artifacts. Across from her sat a man who had built systems that powered cities, negotiated contracts with governments, mentored hundreds. He listened, nodded, and offered his responses gently. She scoffed, mistaking his humility for weakness. The Dunning-Kruger effect thrives in the early stages of learning, when someone knows just enough to be dangerous, but not enough to recognize the vast ocean of what they don't know. She had confidence, yes, but it wasn't grounded in competence. It was rooted in a fragile ego, needing to prove itself. And so, she rejected advice, dismissed mentorship, and isolated herself in a bubble of perceived superiority. Over time, her projects failed, slowly, quietly, not catastrophically, but consistently. Deadlines slipped, budgets strained, and the older man, the one she had mocked, was the one asked to step in and repair the damage. But he didn't scold her. He didn't say, "I told you so." He simply offered help again, calmly, like a man who had seen this all before. The truly wise know something most people don't. Real knowledge makes you more humble, not less, because the more you know, the more you realize how much more there is to learn. The intern, eventually, would look back on that moment with a blend of shame and gratitude, because she didn't need to be corrected. She needed to grow. And growth only happens when arrogance gives way to awareness. He had a ring light, a mic, and 1,000,000 followers. In a world fueled by algorithms, that was all he needed. Credentials, experience, peer-reviewed studies, irrelevant. He had clout. Every day, he gave advice about psychology, about trauma, about relationships. He spoke with passion, clarity, and conviction. And that made him believable, even when he was dangerously wrong. The Dunning-Kruger effect thrives in the digital age, because platforms reward confidence, not truth. Virality doesn't care whether your knowledge is real, just whether it's delivered with force. So he made bold claims, simplified complex ideas, and offered one-size-fits-all solutions to problems that required nuance, empathy, and deep understanding. People believed him, not because he was right, but because he looked the part. But behind the screen, real therapists watched in horror. Real scientists sighed in frustration, because they knew how fragile the human mind is, and how easily it can be harmed by bad advice wrapped in charisma. This is the hidden cost of the Dunning-Kruger effect. When the ignorant feel lies, the wise become invisible. And when misinformation spreads faster than truth, people suffer in silence. Eventually, one of his followers made a tragic choice, following advice that had no scientific grounding. And while the influencer deleted his post and moved on, a family did not. Intention doesn't matter when the damage is done. And in the realm of truth, responsibility grows with reach. But the Dunning-Kruger effect blinds its victims to that weight. He never stopped posting. He ran on simplicity. He had answers to every question, short, sharp, and absolute. The people loved him for it. No nuance, no hesitation, just certainty. Behind the curtain, his advisors scrambled. Economists warned. Diplomats begged for caution. Experts left their posts in frustration. But he kept pushing forward, wrapped in a bubble of confidence thick enough to repel facts. This is how the Dunning-Kruger effect infects leadership. Not only does the incompetent rise, they surround themselves with silence because they interpret warnings as threats to their ego. The irony is cruel. Those who know the least often crave power the most, and once in power, they silence the very people who could steer them away from disaster. Every failed policy, every backlash, every diplomatic crisis, he blamed others, never questioned his own judgment. Because to question would be to open the door to doubt, and doubt is unbearable when your entire identity is built on illusion. The nation began to suffer. Slowly, the economy trembled. The people became divided. Truth became a matter of opinion. And the man who once seemed so sure now looked like a ghost, chasing shadows. Competence requires humility. Leadership requires the courage to say, "I don't know." But the Dunning-Kruger effect erases that possibility and leaves behind only wreckage. He didn't lose because he was evil. He lost because he was certain. He was promoted not because he was the best, but because he was the most confident. When asked to lead the team, he accepted with pride, unaware that leadership required more than a title. It required depth, humility, and the ability to listen. From the start, he dismissed suggestions from subordinates. He overruled experienced voices in favor of gut instinct. When projects faltered, he blamed others. When outcomes succeeded, he claimed credit. Slowly, morale dropped, creativity died, and turnover increased. The most tragic part, he thought he was doing well. He genuinely believed he was a great leader. Because in his mind, leadership meant control, not growth, authority, not collaboration. This is the trap of the Dunning-Kruger effect. Those who lack skill are often blind to their own limitations, while simultaneously overestimating their abilities. He didn't know what he didn't know, and so he stayed stagnant. The team became quiet. Not because they agreed, but because they knew disagreement would go nowhere. One by one, the best minds left, replaced by those too passive or too tired to challenge him. But systems don't lie. KPIs slipped, clients left, and finally, the board intervened. In the exit interview, he was stunned. "Why didn't anyone tell me?" he asked. But they had. He just never listened. Competence is not about having all the answers. It's about creating a space where better answers can emerge, even if they don't come from you. That is the paradox. The Dunning-Kruger victim never grasps. He didn't lose the job because he was evil. He lost it because he confused confidence with competence. And in doing so, killed the very team that could have made him great. In the university's marble halls, a young student stood before a centuries-old painting. He scoffed. "I don't get why this is considered genius," he said, loud enough for others to hear. "Looks like a mess to me." His friends laughed, emboldened by his bravado. Nearby, an old art historian overheard. She approached gently, not to scold, but to ask, "What do you see?" The boy shrugged. Random brush strokes, poor proportions, overrated. He was certain in his dismissal, despite never having studied art, technique, or history. The historian nodded and smiled. "When I was your age, I thought the same. Then, I spent 40 years trying to understand what I was looking at." She wasn't being sarcastic. She was being honest. This is the Dunning-Kruger trap. When people with little knowledge believe they can judge what they don't understand, because the illusion of insight is often more comfortable than the humility of learning. Art, like life, reveals itself in layers. The student mistook simplicity for stupidity. But behind that canvas were revolutions in technique, defiance of norms, and the fingerprint of a mind grappling with beauty and pain. He could have learned that if he had asked questions instead of mocking the answers. But ego is loud. It protects ignorance with a shell of sarcasm and certainty. Later that year, the student failed a key exam, not because he wasn't intelligent, but because he refused to respect the process. He assumed understanding would come quickly, like content on a screen. But real knowledge doesn't arrive. It's earned. And sometimes, it starts by admitting, "I don't yet see what others see." That moment of humility is the first step out of ignorance. Every group has one: the self-declared life coach, the therapist without training, the philosopher without study. He had advice for heartbreak, finances, careers, even parenting, despite having no children, no business, and a trail of personal disasters behind him. What made him dangerous wasn't that he gave advice. It was that he gave it with absolute certainty. No room for complexity, no acknowledgement of exceptions, just rules. Unbreakable, universal rules. His friends once saw him as confident, then, slowly, as arrogant, and finally, as exhausting. But many still followed his words, because people are drawn to clarity, even if it's wrong, when they're drowning in doubt. This is the Dunning-Kruger curse in relationships. People who don't know themselves often think they know others best. And the more they misunderstand their own flaws, the more obsessed they become with fixing others. He wasn't malicious. He genuinely believed he was helping. But intention doesn't equal insight. And sometimes, advice given in ignorance is more harmful than no advice at all. Eventually, one friend confronted him, gently, kindly. "You always have answers, but you never ask questions." It landed like a crack in the armor. For a moment, he paused. But then, he doubled down, because self-reflection is the hardest mirror to face. Wisdom doesn't shout. It listens. It humbles itself before complexity. But the Dunning-Kruger mind cannot afford that vulnerability. To do so would mean admitting the facade of knowing was just that, a facade. The group drifted, not in anger, but in silence. One by one, they learned the cost of mistaking confidence for clarity. And in time, so did he. In a world obsessed with opinions, the loudest voice often drowns out the wisest one. That's the curse of the Dunning-Kruger effect. Not merely that ignorance exists, but that it speaks with conviction, while wisdom whispers in doubt. We've seen it in boardrooms and classrooms, in friendships and leadership, in online debates and quiet moments of misjudgment. The illusion of competence gives a dangerous kind of power, the power to mislead, to mismanage, and sometimes to destroy. But the real tragedy is not stupidity itself. It's the refusal to grow past it. Intelligence isn't just what you know. It's your ability to recognize what you don't know. It's the courage to be wrong, the curiosity to ask, and the humility to listen. If you're never uncertain, never questioning, never challenged, you're not confident. You're blind. True intelligence doesn't need to prove itself. It seeks truth, not applause. And it welcomes complexity, even when it's uncomfortable. So when you meet the overconfident novice, the arrogant leader, or even the part of yourself tempted to fake mastery, remember, certainty is not the mark of genius. Curiosity is. Because in the end, the wisest people aren't the ones with all the answers. They're the ones who keep asking better questions.